Hi again and welcome back. In the previous episode, we set up the level and the camera. And in this episode, we will add collisions between the player and the spikes, as well as between the player and the finish. Alright, let's get moving then. First, we need to add colliders for the spikes and the finish. Select the spikes and add Box Collider 2D component. We need to modify the size of the collider to something more suitable. For size, 2.4 on the x-axis and 0.35 on the y-axis. And for offset, minus 1.05 on the y-axis. Now the collider roughly covers the area of the spikes. One more thing we need to do for this collider. We don't want the player to float on top of the spikes when it hits them, so we need to check the is trigger option on. This option disables the physical boundaries but will still detect when other collider enters inside of the trigger area. Let's do the same for the exit sign. We don't want the level to be finished before the player has passed the sign, so let's move the collider on the right side. 3 is a good offset on the x-axis. Let's also adjust the size. 3 on the x and 5 on the y. We need to set this one to is trigger as well. Before jumping into code, we will add tags to these objects. So while the finish object is selected, press from the tag menu on the top and choose Finish tag. Then select the spikes and open the tag menu. This time there is no suitable default tag, so we need to create one. Click on Add Tag, press plus, and give the name Enemy to the tag. After that, select the spikes again and choose the enemy tag from the tag menu. Now both of the objects should be tagged. Okay, now it's time for coding. Open the player script. So, how would we detect when something enters inside of the trigger? We can open the Unity Scripting API references and search from there. Search for Trigger 2D. Here we see the MonoBehavior dot on trigger enter 2D. That is the thing we are looking for. So, after the fixed updates curly brackets, we need to create a new function. Write void on trigger enter 2D, parentheses, and inside of them collider 2D other. Remember also to add curly brackets after the parentheses. Check that all the uppercase letters are correct. The collider 2D is the type of the parameter and other is just a name, like we would be naming a variable. Now, we need to write an if statement, which checks if the trigger collider that hits the player happens to belong to spikes. We will do this by checking if that game object has a certain tag, in this case, enemy. So, write if other dot game object dot tag 2 equals to marks, and then enemy inside of double quotes, and finally curly brackets. Make sure that the name you write here is exactly the same as the tag you assigned to spikes. Then inside of the curly brackets, write rb.simulated equals to false for testing purposes. After that, write the same if statement, but this time change the tag to finish. This will deactivate physics simulations from the rigid body when we hit either of the objects. Let's save the script and test it in play mode. As we see, the player stops when it hits the spikes, but we still can turn the player and the animation are still functioning. Let's get back to code to fix this. We need somehow to tell the game if the player has hit the spikes or reached the goal that we can't control the player anymore. So, let's create a Boolean variable for this purpose. Under the speed variable, write public bool can control and semicolon. Then, in start function, write can control equals to true. Now we want to set it to false when we hit the spikes or the goal. So inside of those if statements, write can control equals to false. We don't need the RP simulated lines anymore, so let's delete them. Currently, the Boolean doesn't affect anything, it just gets switched to false when the player hits the spikes or the goal. So, what we need to do is that in fixed update, we will put all the code inside of a new if statement, which checks if we can still control the player. Under the y-speed variable, write if can control. When checking if a Boolean is true, we don't need to write equals to true after it. The name of the Boolean is enough. Now, when adding the curly brackets, be careful. Type the first curly bracket after the can control if statement and the last after the curly brackets of the else if statement, where we check if the player is not moving. So, make sure that all of the input related if statements are inside of the can control if statement. Let's save the script and test it. It works! We can no longer turn the player. Now, there is only the animation part to deal with. For reaching the goal, it's easy. We just need to command the animation to transition back to idle. Let's do that now. Inside of the if statement for finish, write anim.setBool moving false. When the player reaches the goal, it will stop and return to idle animation. Save the script and get back to Unity. Let's disable the spikes from this checkbox next to its name for now and test with the finish game object. It works and looks okay. Activate the spikes. Last thing we will do is that we will assemble the dying animation and make the transitions for it. So, let's expand the animation window and create a new animation clip for the player. Give it a name, Death. Then add sprite property for it and drag the first frame of death animation to the timeline. After that, delete the two existing keyframes and move the new keyframe to the beginning. And then drag Death 1 to the timeline to 0.05 seconds. Do the same to the rest of the death frames, always leaving 0.05 seconds between them. When you are ready, go to the animation folder and select the death clip. Uncheck the loop time checkbox because we don't want this animation to repeat itself forever. We just want it to play once and stay in the last frame. Next, let's switch to Animator window. A new box has been created for our dying animation. Let's create a new parameters first. Click on the small plus from the Parameters tab and choose Bool. Give it a name of your choice. I will name it Death. Then right-click on Idle and make transition to Death. Do the same for Walk. Then select the transition from Walk to Death and add a new condition. Change the condition to Death and let the value be true. Then expand the settings and change the transition duration to 0.03. Also remember to uncheck the Has Exit Time checkbox. Then do the same for the transition from Idle to Death. Cool, we're almost done. Now we need only to add one line of code. So let's open the script. In the if statement for enemy, write anim.setBool death true. Save the script and return to Unity. Let's see how it works like in play mode. Great, it works just as it should. Now we are done for this episode. We have added the collisions and disabled the player's controls when it hits spikes or reaches the goal. There is a problem, however. The player can't get past the spikes. Therefore, in the next episode, we will add jumping ability to the player. Remember to save the scene. See you in the next episode.